Hey guys, welcome back to it. So today we're going to be tackling diet nutrition as our health behavior, and then we are going to round out today's lecture with a couple of relevant health conditions, specifically obesity and the three eating disorders, which are anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. Okay, so before we get into diet nutrition, I find that it is helpful to explore the history of body image and what's considered normative versus not, because at least from my perspective, that has really helped to explain why people are driven to the behaviors that they are today. So historically, famine and malnutrition are more commonly global health concerns, and this is still the case today in underdeveloped nations. And so this fosters an evolutionary and I would say societal desire for fats, sugars, and calories because these things aren't as common. People are literally dying from malnutrition and famine. And so we are wanting these things very, very desperately. And so full figures are more frequently seen as signs of prosperity among the wealthy. And you can even see this if you do like an art history kind of deep dive that sculptures and depictions of women look very different hundreds and thousands of years ago compared to today. And that fuller figure is something that was more revered because it was something that was rarer. And so what we see today is weirdly kind of flip of that. So we're still kind of chasing the rarity, but because Western culture and Western diets have made supersized figures more accessible these days, creating a worldwide health concern relating to cardiometabolic conditions. Now, that rarity, that thing that everybody's chasing, is more of that sleek look, which boils down more specifically to a thin ideal for females and a muscular ideal for males. And social media, more specifically within the last decade or so, adds additional pressure in that it's kind of expected that a person be camera ready, so to speak, 24/7 and kind of look their best. So this is adding additional pressure onto how a person looks and how that impacts their self-esteem versus at least prior to the advent of social media, you might have still been feeling the pressure of those ideals, but it wasn't this 24/7 type of pressure. And so that leads us into really where we are today. And so before we get into some different explanations as to why people gravitate towards nutrition and dietary advice that is unhealthy, let's first start off with really basic intro to nutrition and kind of what is healthy. So, in a nutshell, there are 46 nutrients that contribute to overall health, and those include water, three macronutrients, and 42 micronutrients. Our macronutrients are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Proteins contribute 4 kilocalories per gram and should encompass about 20% of a person's diet. They are helpful in that they contribute to the physical structure of our body, our musculature. But then on a more micro level, they also contribute to our body's antibodies and our immune functioning. Fats contribute 9 kilocalories per gram and should encompass about 30% of our diet. Fats are helpful in that they protect our body. They provide that nice cushioning around our torso and all of the important stuff that's beneath. They also provide an aesthetic, which a lot of people don't really realize. And I know that these days fat is kind of gaining new popularity that it didn't really have in the 90s, but it's ironic that, in the 90s, everyone wanted everything low fat. And the idea behind that was aesthetics, that you wanted to lose weight and be, more desirable. But weirdly enough, cutting fat so much does take away from a person aesthetically, and that fats are necessary for the health of our hair, skin, and nails. Fat also provides just kind of a healthy plumpness and roundness to the body that is really lacking otherwise. And then finally, we have carbohydrates, which contribute the same number of calories per gram as protein. They should encompass 50% of our diet. And this is because carbohydrates are our body's main energy source. Micronutrients, generally speaking, can be divided into two categories. We have minerals and vitamins. Minerals are inorganic, um, like iron, calcium, potassium, and then vitamins are organic in nature, and they include specifically vitamins A, C, D, E, K, and the 8B vitamins. So what works? What is a healthy diet? What does healthy nutrition look like? Stuff that does work includes a moderate or whole foods type of diet, which broadly speaking is what I showed you guys on the previous slide. Aim to consume 20% protein, 30% fat, 50% carbohydrates, and aim to consume more whole foods, meaning that we're aiming for eggs, meats, legumes, avocado, fish, oils, fruits, veggies, grains, versus consuming, things that are more processed. So that's a really basic diet that people frequently overlook. I think because of its simplicity, there's definitely human nature to want to make things sometimes more complicated than they need to be because there's frustration with the simple thing being simple in nature, but sometimes more difficult to put into practice. And so we want to complicate it to kind of explain why the simple thing isn't working or we feel like it's not working. So that's one thing that works. We're also specifically today going to talk about the Mediterranean diet, the pesco-vegetarian diet, which you guys read about earlier, that can be beneficial for certain mental health conditions. We'll talk a little bit about the plant-based diet that the Blue Zones reading discussed. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about intermittent fasting, and I do have an additional reading for you guys on that topic. I started adding this to my lecture maybe a year or two ago, just because I found I was getting lots of questions from students. But then the idea of some fasting also does kind of fit in with the Blue Zones research. And so I decided to include that discussion for those reasons. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the stuff that doesn't really work. So we're going to talk about the idea of just kind of consuming everything that's labeled as natural. And we're going to talk about detoxes, we're going to talk about bad diets, and we're also going to talk about equating the way that you look with health and only assuming you're healthy if you look a certain way, and how all of those things can be really unhealthy. Okay, so up first we have the natural fallacy. Which is basically the idea that anything labeled as natural or organic is automatically good for you. A lot of the origin of this myth kind of goes back to scholars will kind of point to like the Garden of Eden myth that like everything was fine and good and then man came along and screwed everything up. And so everything that is natural is good and everything associated with man, i.e. everything that is artificial, is automatically bad. And more specifically, I find that this idea of good and bad, that when you peel back the layers, what that really means is that people are talking about what is going to contribute to them living longer or looking better. And then if push comes to shove and you were prioritizing longevity or something that would improve a person's appearance but not necessarily be healthy, that more people tend to kind of grab at those things versus the things that are at their core healthy but that aren't necessarily going to contribute to longevity or appearance. Because in fact, if we're really thinking about health and what is normal, death is normal. It's something that's going to happen to all of us. And so in a weird way, chasing longevity is very counter to this idea of what is natural and what is health. And so basically just seeing something being labeled as natural, quote unquote, or organic does not necessarily mean that it's associated with good health. It could be associated more so or advertised more so from the perspective of longevity or appearance, which again, as I mentioned, aren't necessarily associated with health. Beyond that, there are kind of some layers to this idea of food being organic or not as well. There's little nutritional difference between foods that are organic and foods that aren't. And really, when it comes to buying organic, it makes more sense to think about what it is you are purchasing, and to purchase organic or not based on the type of food. So if you're buying a fruit or a vegetable that has like a skin or an outer layer that's removed, it's not as necessary that that be organic. So, like a banana, for instance. But a food where you're eating the entirety of it, like a strawberry, that would be something where buying organic could make a little bit more sense. But if we're talking nutritionally and not just kind of what was used to grow the food, there's very little nutritional difference between organic foods and inorganic foods. Beyond that, when you start looking at like the big nationwide producers of organic foods, those farms and methods don't really resemble what a lot of people think of when they think of organic. When people think organic, they think, you know, local farmer who's growing the food by hand and taking the time and care to, get rid of pesticides in a way that is not using chemicals. And that's just not really the way that it's happening on these big, massive organic farms. These big farms really look very similar to inorganic farms. The only difference is what is being used to grow the food. And if you really want to be shopping with that kind of idyllic farmer, homegrown kind of idea in mind, really the thing that you need to be doing in that situation is buying local versus buying organic from like Publix or a big store like that. Beyond that, the idea of what's natural or what's organic and not can also be a little bit confusing, as things that are natural can be really dangerous. Things that are organic can be really dangerous. Um, the two examples I give of this are arsenic and copper sulfate. Arsenic is a chemical element, so it doesn't really get much more natural than that, but it's very dangerous. You should not consume arsenic. Copper sulfate is an organic pesticide, but it's extremely dangerous and it should not be used. And there are inorganic pesticides that, if given the choice between the organic copper sulfate and the inorganic alternative, you should definitely go with the inorganic alternative. So, again, those are just some examples to kind of set up the idea that we put a lot more weight on these words than is warranted. Um, and because of that weight that people like to put on the words natural and organic, that really means that at the end of the day, there can be some danger associated with making decisions exclusively based on the idea that something is natural or organic. So, for instance, I mean, is this natural cat food really that much different than, an alternative? Is this organic Gatorade better for you than regular Gatorade, or better for you than, just water? Are these brands of cigarettes and alcohol better? Are they suddenly fine for you because they're organic? My favorite example is the crappy beer brand Natural Light. That certainly isn't good for you or natural in any way, despite the name. Um, but beyond just kind of marketing and decisions to buy products based on the label that's kind of ascribed to them or not, it can also be really dangerous to hop on to more general health advice just because that health advice seems more natural or holistic or organic in nature. So, like, I've included this a random copy of an example book that I found that is called Cancer Hacks, a holistic guide to overcoming your fears and healing cancer. And it's really kind of based in changing up your diet. And that basically, this woman's writing this book because this worked for her. But the thing you have to remember about these types of books, or any kind of self help book in general that's written from the perspective of, like, hey, this worked for me, it'll work for you too, is that we don't really know whether this advice will work for other people or whether this person was an outlier. So I've kind of included this graph on the far right-hand side of the screen to describe what an outlier is, it's a data point that doesn't really go with the flow of the rest of the data points. So did this dietary change work for this woman because this is a good change that could help other people? Or is there something kind of quirky about her physiology, and her personality where maybe she responded to this intervention, but this intervention isn't really going to work for others? And we'll talk about that idea of kind of placebos and data a little bit more so in chapter 15. But for now, just kind of take away that just because something is labeled as natural or organic or seems like it'd be good advice, that you really have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Are we really talking about health, or are we instead talking about longevity and appearance? Are we really talking about something that has scientific backing, or are we talking about something that's more anecdotal in nature? Um, an additional danger point that we might see from an over reliance on kind of natural anecdotes is the tendency to reject everything that is artificial. And this kind of goes back to the Garden of Eden myth, to reject everything man made, artificial, reject things that humans contributed, things like vaccines and GMOs, because these sure as hell are not natural. But there's a lot of good science behind both of those things. Vaccines are man-made, but they've contributed to basically eradicating things like polio, and we're seeing how successful and critical those things are currently during the coronavirus pandemic. Genetically modified organisms are another thing that get a really bad rep, but at the end of the day, there are too many people living on this planet, and if we were growing everything organically, um, there would not be enough food for everybody. Organic is very much a privilege, and if we want to make enough food for everybody, GMOs are something that's necessary. So unless you're on board for famine and a chunk of the human population dying out, GMOs are something that we very much need. Okay, switching gears to something else that doesn't really work in addition to, exclusively pouncing on things that are natural or organic, is this idea of detoxes. Um, and what I love about detoxes is that they have a really creepy, weird origin, and they don't really come from this holistic place of health in the way that many people think that they do. Um, so where these things came from is during the 1900s, John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the Kellogg cereal guy, um, he's a very religious guy, and he believed that masturbation drained one's energy, health, and purity. So masturbation, bad. And so he established the Battle Creek Sanatorium as a healing center where people could be sent for masturbation related ailments or other conditions to be treated. And one of the things that he served or did to kind of treat people at the sanatorium was he created this concoction called granola. And it was one of his treatment components. And he really viewed granola as kind of this hearty, pure, natural type of thing. And basically, yes, if you ate his granola cereal, you would feel better. You would no longer be drained of energy, health, and purity in your masturbation tendencies. And it just so happened that Charles Post, also like the cereal, was a patient at Kellogg's Sanatorium. And so there was born Post and Kellogg cereal, which kind of, originated as kind of this masturbation cure at this sanatorium, but is now being sold more publicly as just kind of the healthy cornerstone of a balanced breakfast. Today, that idea of detoxifying one's body with a cereal has kind of grown to include taking in different types of foods, not specifically cereal, but taking in juices or charcoal or things like that to remove the body of different types of toxins. So the focus has shifted. We're not focused on cereal and masturbation anymore, but we are focused on other types of things like juices and these things that are toxic or wrong with our bodies that need to be removed in some way by adjusting what it is we're eating. At the end of the day, any effect that is observed from these approaches is placebo in nature or associated with just decreasing one's water weight. At the end of the day, we happen to have two handy dandy organs that are really good at detoxifying our kidneys and our liver. So our body has built-in detoxifiers. In a way, nature's got this. Our bodies naturally can detoxify themselves. You do not need to do extra crap to detoxify your body. Fad diets are another thing that people really like to pounce on. I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier at the introduction to the lecture that I think personally one of the reasons for this is this idea of just consuming a balanced diet seems too simple that no, I do that and it doesn't work, and so the solution has to be eliminating something. And part of this probably also relates back to the idea that body shape equals health. And so someone could consume a moderate balanced diet but not be a Victoria's Secret model, and so this isn't working, and the solution is restriction and to kind of cut something out. And so ultimately, fad diets emerge because food decisions stop being based on health and balance. They're based on what a person looks like. Beyond that, taste, cost, and convenience also weigh in heavily as the top three reasons why people make their food choices, which contributes to an excessive diagnosis of overweight and obesity, setting the stage for these diets to, help people lose weight quickly. And so elimination and restriction are being thought of as the secret, that a balanced diet isn't going to work. Um, and as we know, that whenever we restrict something, so whenever we cut out fat or carbs or Tom Brady, if you want to cut out nightshades and MSG and cold cuts and pineapple and all of his funky stuff. The problem is that when you cut stuff out, that if you are too rigid with your restriction, it can breed this kind of excessive bingy type of mentality where it's almost like this little kid who's drinking this dirty water off of the floor. Um, when you restrict too much, it's like when any food is in front of you, there's a greater tendency to just go in face first and overdo it. And it's because you're restricting too much to begin with. So restriction really breeds binges and weight gain. And so that's one of the reasons that these diets don't work is we restrict too much and that just breeds binges. Beyond that, people think of diets as like a temporary thing, like I'm on a diet and then I'm off a diet. But technically speaking, we are all on a diet. Not all diets are aimed at cutting weight. A diet is simply just a word that describes what it is you eat. And so, really, you need to be on a diet that works for you over the course of your life. Because otherwise, if you cut some stuff out and then you're off the diet, you're going to put the weight back on. Like diets, it's not like once you hit this point that you're done and you can check that off of your list. Your body is going to respond to what you're eating. Um, and so if you cut stuff to lose weight and then stop doing that, you're going to gain weight again. And again, because so many people falsely equate the way that they look with their health, um, they are more prone to do these things that aren't really healthful, even when they may have been more healthy before, just with a body that, might not have really factored into the ideal, so to speak. And so that brings us to the idea of health. And a lot of this goes back to advertisers and marketers and the messages that we get from society about health. Advertisers love to capitalize on the desire for quote unquote health, which is really the desire for longevity and improved appearance, and the fear of human intervention. So the fear of what is artificial or man made. And so, in capitalizing on this, they like to use a lot of scientific jargon and flashy placebos to make you think things are more effective than they are. Um, Great examples are this ionic foot detox machine where you buy this thing and you stick it in some water and you put your feet in there, and then the water turns this nasty color. And look at all the gross stuff that came out of you. And the different colors mean different things. Um, That's very flashy. That's very impressive. In reality, though, there are, I believe, iron and copper in these machines. And so, even if you just let them run in an empty pool of water, they're going to create rust and the water is going to change color. So, it means absolutely nothing, but it looks really impressive. Another example of something that's really jargony is the lymph. Trampoline workouts give your lymphatic system the Bellicon treatment, with these kind of flashy pictures of the lymph system and lymph vessels and lymph nodes. That's very jargony, and how that feels to the average consumer is like, wow, this is so scientific and so impressive. Like, it must work. And so that jargon is kind of used as almost like a Trojan horse to kind of sneak in this thing that really doesn't have any basis. Um, Clickbait, sponsored content are things that are also used widely online to kind of get people to buy and spend their money on, again, quote unquote, health. Influencers and celebrities can be used to peddle, like appetite suppressing lollipops and crap like that. And at the end of the day, all of this exploits gaps in science, in that scientists will admit when they don't know something, um, which is the right scientific thing to do. We don't know everything, but marketers won't admit when they don't know something. And so that does kind of create this unfair battlefield where, one group is saying they do have the answers to everything and one group isn't. And one group is using this kind of flashy jargon and the other group isn't. And so that kind of drives human traffic in that direction. And then finally, as I've mentioned before, there's this huge kind of nationwide confusion as to how health and physical appearance match up. Like, for instance, I have these three examples of women's health magazine covers. So, this magazine is supposed to be about health, yet on every single one, strong and sexy, lean and sexy, hot and happy, it's all about how you look. It's not about, is your doctor telling you that you have healthy cholesterol levels? Is your doctor telling you that your blood pressure is within a healthy range? It's about the way that you look. And so at the end of the day, people will sometimes actually opt for these unhealthy options out of desperation to get their bodies to look this impossible way that is photoshopped and to look like these people whose job it literally is to look this way. When in reality, you can be healthy and look very different. Health has a huge variety of bodies. Weight's also influenced by a variety of things, including set points, metabolism, damaged metabolism, genetics, and that people can improve their health without physically changing their body, as you guys saw earlier in that REI video about Myrna. Okay, so that's all the crap that doesn't really work. So again, to recap, that would be buying things just because they're labeled as natural or organic, overly trusting anecdotes, detoxes, fad diets, and buying something just because some influencer or celebrity is peddling it, or because it's flashy or overly jargony, or because the word health is being confused with hot or never dying. So those are things that don't work. Things that do work include the Mediterranean diet. What I really like about the Mediterranean diet is that even though the word diet is being used here, it's really a Mediterranean lifestyle. And so this version of the food pyramid incorporates not just foods that should be consumed in various quantities, but there's also an acknowledgement of regular physical activity and savoring meals with loved ones. So it's very much a lifestyle that includes social components and movement components. Food also isn't criminalized. So even at the top, you see things that should be limited, but not completely restricted or removed from one's diet. And again, the emphasis on being active and taking time, so resting, taking time off to have a sit down lunch with people that you enjoy. So very different than kind of the fast paced Western culture we live in, but very on brand with the blue zones data that we talked about earlier. Taking breaks, being active, no restriction, socializing with loved ones. A similar diet is the pesco-vegetarian diet, which I specifically will prescribe sometimes for various mental health reasons. Specifically, if someone is experiencing one of the affective or schizophrenic disorders listed below, which would include schizophrenia, age-related cognitive decline, bipolar and unipolar depression, or perinatal depression. And again, the reason that these groups are identified is because inflammation may be associated with both groups of disorders. And so we can potentially address some of that inflammation via dietary change. And the key is basically fish and sunlight and colorful fruits and vegetables. So fish, we want to encourage that the person consume fatty omega-3 acids and things like salmon, and avoid high mercury fish like swordfish, that they consume a rainbow of fruits and vegetables. And at the end of the day, we're trying to get them to about 1,000 milligrams of EPA each day and to about 600 units a day of vitamin D. So the preference for this is that a person consume 1 or 2 servings of like salmon or shellfish to get to that EPA level, or that they get out for 10 to 15 minutes in the sun. So it's preferable that you do this in the more natural way. However, in the winter, getting outside can be difficult, so sometimes I'll prescribe vitamin D. You can also use fish oil potentially, but again, I really like to work with people to see if I can get them to make that behavioral change to incorporate more fish into their diet. But if they are doing the supplement, EPA is specifically what we're looking for. So I showed you guys an example of what like a fish oil supplement fact label looks like, and highlighted the area where the EPA is. And so again, we're aiming for 1,000 milligrams a day. So they would have to consume however many tablets to kind of hit that point. A plant-based diet is also an empirically supported diet, and you guys can see these are 3 of the 5 blue zones, Sardinia, Okinawa, and Loma Linda. And you can see that these are all plant-based, not vegetarian. So fish, meat, and poultry encompass, a small chunk of all of these diets, but the vast majority, we're talking plant-based in nature. So an important thing to point out here is that there's no restriction, there's no kind of absolute elimination of anything. We're just focusing more so on plant-based foods. And beyond that, we could definitely get into debates about whether or not meat is quote unquote bad for you. And at the end of the day, research is going to tell you a bunch of different things about meat, and you could really approach meat from a bunch of different angles, but there's absolutely no data suggesting that any disease is attributable to vegetables. So from that perspective, you can't really go wrong with more of a plant-based diet. And that's kind of the sticking point that I always come back to when I'm talking to people about limiting meat consumption, is that vegetables don't really cause any negative consequences. So why don't we just try to up your intake of those, and maybe think about it more that way, that we're upping your intake of vegetables versus decreasing your intake of something else, and that it'll kind of all naturally balance out. Intermittent fasting is the final dietary approach I want to discuss. In a nutshell, how this works is that a person is restricting their feeding window to 8 hours a day, meaning that there are only 8 hours over the course of the day when a person can eat. And it's up to the individual what they want their 8-hour window to be. So for example, you could eat from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. You could eat from 1 p.m. until 9 p.m., whatever, just as long as you're eating for 8 hours and then not eating for 9 hours. And there are no nutrient restrictions while you are eating. So it's not like you're only trying to eat, protein and fat, but no carbs, or that you're limiting your calories. You can eat whatever as long as it's within that 8-hour window. And again, the 8 hours can be whenever. Yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell what intermittent fasting is. There is some evidence for variants of this happening in blue zones. in that there is a general emphasis on not overeating, but this is accomplished in various ways, not necessarily through intermittent fasting. So we've got the small plates piece that we saw in Okinawa, Japan. Similarly, the lack of a family style way of eating where everybody makes a small plate in the kitchen, the food's put away, everybody sits down and eats to that 80% fullness versus just kind of laying out all the food and going back for seconds and thirds and eating until a person is completely full. There's also religious fasting that we saw in Loma Linda, where people would fast for a day each week. Um, so again, different than intermittent fasting, but evidence of some type of approach whereby we limit what we eat, either the amount or the times that we eat. Some of the proposed mechanisms include increased longevity, which of course explains its popularity, as well as enhanced cardiovascular and brain health. Some of the proposed mechanisms, in layman's terms, relate to increased metabolism and fewer free radicals and oxidative damage due to less digestion time. And I'm going to have you guys pursue this idea of intermittent fasting more through this additional reading that I have linked on As You Learn. Okay, so consequences of poor nutrition include obesity and the eating disorders, which include anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating. So let's talk about obesity first. The most frequent measure that's used to diagnose obesity is body mass index, or BMI. And you can see the BMI delineations on the upper right-hand corner of the screen. One of the reasons that BMI is used is because it is easy to calculate. You just need to know a person's sex, their height, and their weight. And this strongly correlates with body fat percentage, which is what's really important. So it's not that height and weight per se are these inherently important numbers, but it's that they relate to this important number, which is body fat percentage. And it's much more complicated to directly measure body fat percentage than it is to measure BMI. And so BMI is used as kind of like a surrogate for body fat percentage. A healthy body fat is 25 to 30% for women and 18 to 23% for men. But one of the limitations of BMI is that it doesn't quite give us the whole picture. It indicates body fat percentage, but doesn't really tell us where that body fat is, which, as it turns out, is extremely important because abdominal obesity, sometimes referred to as meal pattern obesity or apple-shaped obesity, is the more dangerous type of obesity, and it is more strongly associated with cardiometabolic diseases. So this basically means someone who is carrying their excess weight on their torso versus on their hips. And so for that reason, waist to hip ratios are a better predictor of mortality and health than BMI, because we're getting an indicator of body fat percentage, but we're also getting an indicator as to where that fat is, which, as we've already established, is the more important piece. So for women, we're looking for a waist to hip ratio less than 0.8, and for men, less than 0.95. All right. So that in a nutshell is what obesity is. It is excess body fat, typically when it is existing along the abdomen. So let's talk about where it comes from. What are some of the underlying factors? Biologically, obesity may be up to 50% heritable, which is pretty common. That's kind of a standard heritability rate. And more specifically, some of the things that we may inherit are a tendency for one type of metabolism versus another, which can play a role in setting our cravings, how efficiently our body works through the calories that we consume, and therefore the weight that our body tends to prefer. Our gut biome is also something that contributes biologically to an obese weight. Our gut biome is basically the microorganisms that live in our guts, which might seem kind of gross, but it is something that happens. We've got a bunch of little guys living inside of us who play a huge role in both sides of our body's energy balance equation. The microorganisms in our gut can contribute to cravings, how hungry we are, and they can also contribute to our metabolism, or how quickly we are burning through what it is we consume. And the composition of our microbiome may be altered by our diet. So, based on what we eat, that kind of plays a role in determining what kinds of organisms are living in our gut. And at the end of the day, low biome diversity and a high FB ratio, which is a firmicute to bacterioate ratio, are going to be things that are associated with obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Um, and weirdly enough, it kind of turns out that in a nutshell, what you eat, like I said, contributes to the microbiome, and that biome tends to crave some of the same things. So, for instance, if you eat a lot of sugar, then you're basically cultivating a microbiome that is going to crave even more sugar. And at the end of the day, those less healthy microbiomes that contribute to more of those cardiometabolic diseases are ones that are lower in biome diversity and have a higher number of F organisms compared to B organisms. And so, by altering diet, that can be one way to address what we're craving, how hungry we are, how effective our metabolism is. Metabolism is something that is affected by microbiome. It's also something that's affected by genes, as I mentioned earlier. It's also something that's affected by body fat percentage. Fat has a lower metabolic rate, meaning it burns through fewer calories than muscle. And so having a greater fat content on your body is going to inherently lower your overall metabolism. Metabolism may also be, to a degree, permanently damaged by various diagnoses such as metabolic syndrome. Um, in addition to genes, age impacts metabolism. It generally slows down with age. Testosterone, androgens that are associated with the male sex tend to be associated with higher metabolism levels. Men also tend to have lower body fat percentages, which is also going to be associated with higher metabolism. Activity level is also associated with metabolism, in that people who exercise regularly, who are active regularly, tend to have higher metabolisms as well. And then finally, we've got the set point hypothesis, which says that more or less the body wants to defend a current weight range. And some of you may have experienced this before. It's almost like there's a range where your body's happy, and it can be really difficult to gain weight above that range or to lose weight beneath that range. So it's this idea that all of our bodies have kind of this preference for how they want to be, and it can be really difficult to move out of those ranges. Psychologically, obesity is more commonly associated with folks who have obese family members and close friends. Biologically, the family piece would have to do with genes, but psychologically, it really has more to do with modeling and social cues. So, if you're surrounded with people who are eating unhealthfully, that increases the likelihood that you're going to eat in the same way. Or if you live in a system where there are regular social cues to overeat, like celebrations, holidays, days of the week, um, like Sundays are the day that you have a big, family dinner with lots of mac and cheese and stuff like that, those are going to be things that could contribute to obesity. And the blue zone research kind of asserts that the opposite is true as well, that it is important to have close friends around you, but it's important that those people also think the same way that you do about health in order for you to continue to pursue health. Because, you're going to be more likely to go for a walk every day or go to the farmer's market if you have friends who do those same things. Some other psychosocial factors include culturally conditioned cues to eat. For instance, in this country, we are told to eat more so around the holidays, when you're celebrating something big like a birthday, wedding, a birth, graduation. Um, we also have this idea of comfort food. So you eat when you're happy and you're celebrating, and it's the holidays, then you also eat when you're sad and you need comfort. There are several high risk racial groups, specifically Black women, or Black individuals. Sorry, I don't know why I said women. Black folks, um, Hispanic Americans or Latinx folks and Native Americans are more likely to be diagnosed with obesity compared to their white and Asian counterparts. Interestingly, though, while African American teens are at a higher risk for more of the cardiometabolic diagnoses, they're less concerned with adhering to a thin ideal than other groups. And because of this, they have less body dissatisfaction and maybe less inclined to some of the more restrictive eating disorders. So there's kind of some pros and cons, I guess, with that particular racial group. From an SES perspective, there's an inverse relationship between obesity and SES in developed countries, meaning that the higher SES you are, the less likely it is to develop an obese weight range. Less education is also associated with higher rates of obesity, which suggests that obesity is something that is an obese weight range is a weight range that's easier to achieve through diets that are higher in processed foods, diets that are cheaper, more convenient, the types of diets that you're more likely to see among lower SES folks. Depression is something that may also drive a diagnosis of obesity. Binge eating disorder can also be a part of obesity as well. One treatment approach that I really like is called stepped care. And stepped care, in a nutshell, is a general approach that could really be used with different diagnoses. The essence of it is that we break down patients according to their risk and then prescribe certain treatments based on risk. And then a person could step up, so to speak, if their risk increases or if a lower level of care isn't yielding results. And so here you can see that people have been classified according to their weight, what percentage overweight they are, and prescribed various steps in terms of treatment, which range from self-dieting at the very bottom all the way up to surgery at the very top. Biological interventions, broadly speaking, include bypass surgery and interventions that are aimed more so at microbiomes. Surgeries include these various bariatric approaches. There are multiple approaches. It's not just a singular surgery. Research suggests that bypass surgery may actually increase biodiversity, so that might be one of the reasons that it contributes to weight loss. The surgery may also impact the weight that the body is defending from the set point hypothesis. The surgery also alters one's hormones and contributes to restriction in terms of what a person can eat and their ability to absorb entirely what it is that they eat. Psychological evaluation is required before and after surgery as well. So while it's a biological intervention, there's definitely a psychological component. And then finally, interventions that are aimed more at microbiomes include things like probiotics and yes, fecal transplants as a way of transplanting fecal matter with a healthier microbiome from one person into the body of a person with a less healthy microbiome to kind of get it jump started, so to speak. Psychological interventions for weight loss in general, whether or not you're at an obese weight point or simply overweight, or whether we're talking about someone with a binge eating disorder, broadly speaking, includes setting a weight loss goal only if you're motivated and self-disciplined. I say this because frequently people will get in the habit of like going on a diet, so to speak, like every week, like, oh, I'm, gonna make everything different on Monday, and then by Tuesday or Wednesday, stuff's not working anymore, and so we're just going to try again on Monday. And the problem with this cycle of constantly starting but never getting very far is that in your head kind of teaches you that when you tell yourself you're going to do something, that you're not really serious and it's only going to last for a couple of days. And so I really encourage people to stop. And in fact, I've challenged participants to, or not participants, patients to, like, we're not going to try to diet for the next month. It's just completely off the table, to kind of give them a little bit of a palate cleanser. And then we will seriously start once that motivation is there and the person is going to stick with it. We want to make healthy food choices. So I talk to patients about the moderate whole foods diet, or if they want to adjust the percentages of what they're eating in any way. I encourage more of the Mediterranean, pesco veg, plant-based diet. I may discuss intermittent fasting. I typically don't out and out recommend that, but because it's become more popular recently, I find I get questions about it more. So I'll answer questions, and if someone really wants to do it, I'll kind of talk about how to do it in a healthy way. It is important to take lifestyle and barriers into consideration. So you should not just be giving all patients the same recommendation. I mentioned earlier that lower SES is associated with greater obesity. A lot of that has to do with the foods that are accessible at a lower versus a higher SES. And so it's important to consider that. For instance, I have a friend who's working out in Ashe and Allegheny counties, which are two of the nearby kind of more rural counties than Watauga. And she was working with a nurse out there who was giving all of her patients the advice that they adopt veganism, which makes zero sense in Allegheny County, which is one of the most rural places I've ever been. It would make more sense in that particular situation to maybe talk more about like what are some healthy food choices a person can make using kind of food stamps or WIC sponsored foods that are healthier, maybe trying to make, smaller incremental shifts. But like veganism in that situation is so limiting. And some of these approaches take a good amount of privilege and resources to really pursue. So it's important to be cognizant of that. Similarly, my husband was doing the intermittent fasting a couple years ago when he was working as a high school teacher, and he realized that while he really liked this approach and it worked for him most of the time, that it really didn't work for him on semesters when he had two classes in the morning. So when he had his planning period in the afternoon, he could not make it until noon. I mean, he could, but he would snap at the kids a lot more than he did when he at least had a planning period in the morning. So that's another example of lifestyle really matching a diet versus not. So it's important to kind of keep all that stuff in mind. It's also important to educate people about things like microbiomes. Like if you can just commit to eating healthier, you can start to cultivate healthier microorganisms, which are going to impact your cravings, your appetite, your metabolism. Like I don't really eat a lot of sugar. I don't really know when that happened. I used to really love sweets and I just kind of grew out of it. But part of the reason that that behavior is maintained is because I don't have a lot of sugar craving microorganisms in my gut. So I don't crave it and I just don't enjoy it in the same way. It's important to educate folks about health versus body shape. And there's a ton of research out there suggesting that even if a person doesn't lose weight or their body weight doesn't change as a consequence of health behavior change, that people are healthier when they're moving. People's blood pressure and cholesterol can improve even if their body shape's not improving. And so it can be important to talk to people about the importance of internal health versus what they look like. It also can be helpful to really talk about fasting versus restriction, and that restriction is really what can get people into trouble when they're being way too rigid with the amount of time that they're eating or way too rigid with what they're eating versus not. And that if a person is going to do some type of fasting, this doesn't mean fast and then only eat salads. This means fast, which means you're limiting when you're eating, but you're not limiting what you're eating. It's important to talk about how diet and exercise complement one another. I like talking about the 80% rule. I give that advice to people pretty frequently. Eat slowly and mindfully with no distractions. So, fix your plate and then go sit down and eat versus doing family style. Don't eat in front of the TV. Eat slowly, enjoy your meal, enjoy the people you're with. Don't just kind of eat mindlessly on the go. Social support is helpful to kind of get that accountability when you're making a change. And then finally, it's also important to talk about relapse prevention, which is the idea that, with any behavior change, it's very likely that there's going to be relapse. And that makes sense. If we think about like, I'm trying to eat healthier for the rest of my life, theoretically, that's a really long time to eat perfectly to eat healthfully completely 100% of the time. Like, you're gonna have times where you're not eating healthfully. And that's just, the nature of it. Like, if, again, if you're trying to do something for the rest of your life, whether it's eating differently or exercising or sleeping differently, or making substance use changes, it's just very likely there's going to be some lapse. And so it's important to kind of talk about that and just kind of make plans for what to do when that happens. All right. So, switching gears to our eating disorders, first up we have anorexia. And I'm going to pretty briefly introduce these things to you guys. We're not going to go into like really in-depth levels in terms of diagnosis, but I want you to more or less be familiar with what these diagnoses are, particularly if you are working on more the physical health side of things, to be able to recognize these. And then if you're thinking about working more on the mental health side of things, it would be worth taking a more in-depth diagnosis class to explore these eating disorders more. So, anorexia in a nutshell is a restriction of one's energy intake that leads to a significantly low body weight. Typically, we consider this to be a BMI less than 17, or if we're dealing with someone under the age of 18 who's using the BMI for age delineation, we're looking for someone who is under 5%. This person has also developed an intense fear of gaining weight or persistent behavior that interferes with weight gain. So this is significant because we've got someone who is at a dangerously low weight, so there's no real reason for them to fear gaining weight, or to interfere with weight gain, since where they're at is unhealthy and dangerous. So that's what makes that symptom significant. There's also a disturbance in the way in which body weight is experienced, or a lack of recognition of the seriousness of low weight. So the person may be very, very thin, but look in the mirror and see someone who is overweight or fat or still has weight to lose. So there's kind of this delusional type of quality to anorexia. There are two different types, which a lot of people don't realize. We have the restricting type, which is 3 or more months of dieting, fasting, and or excessive exercise. And then we have the binge eating purging type, which is 3 or more months of binge eating or purging, which includes vomiting, laxatives, diuretics, and enemas. So people with anorexia can have both patterns, but at the end of the day, they're in a calorie deficit, a significant calorie deficit, to the extent that they are getting down to that low body weight. The highest risk age group is going to be young females, ages 15 to 19. That's going to be the most common age of onset. Bulimia nervosa, or bulimia, is going to be recurrent binge eating episodes coupled with recurrent inappropriate compensation. Binge eating episodes are when a person eats an amount of food within an amount of time that most other individuals would consider to be too much. So whether that's half an hour or 2 hours or a whole day, this person's eating more in that amount of time than most other people would consider eating. There's also recurrent inappropriate compensation, which could be vomiting, laxatives, diuretics, fasting, excessive exercise, basically any of the behaviors we talked about on the previous slide. And so this happens in a cycle at least once a week for 3 months. In addition, the person's self-evaluation, or how they feel about themselves, has to be unduly influenced by body weight or shape, meaning that their self-esteem, their self-image is linked to what they look like. Binge eating disorder, we're again looking at recurrent binge eating episodes using the same definition from the previous slide. No compensation, but instead we are seeing binges being associated with at least 3 or more of these 5 symptoms: eating fast, eating until uncomfortably full, eating when not hungry, eating alone out of embarrassment, and feeling disgusted, depressed, or guilty afterwards. The person is distressed by their binges and binges once a week for at least 3 months. Okay. So those are our 3 diagnoses. Unsurprisingly, there are several health complications from each of these diagnoses. The charts that are on the screen are showing the health complications from bulimia, and then also the health complications that we may see from anorexia. I'm not going to read those off for you guys, but I encourage you to kind of look over those in your own time. Some example complications that we might see like dental damage if we're seeing a lot of vomiting. We may see amenorrhea, which is a loss of a period. We may see irregular types of heartbeats or slow heartbeat. We may see swelling. We may see electrolyte changes. So a person may have really low like calcium or potassium or sodium levels. We may see osteoporosis. We may see low blood pressure, low body temperature, things like that. So that's bulimia and anorexia. Binge eating is more associated with the same cardiometabolic complications as obesity. So, I mean, you're going to see higher blood pressure, higher cholesterol levels, things like that. And I do want to point out that only about 5 to 10% of obese individuals are diagnosed with binge eating disorder. So a lot of people think that those two diagnoses are synonymous, but they're not really. Basically, there are a variety of paths to obesity, only one of which is binge eating disorder. As far as the biopsychosocial model of binge eating disorders go, biologically, metabolism is obviously playing a role in all of these. Specifically, we're dealing more with damaged metabolism in all three cases. So if a person is overeating in the case of like bulimia or binge eating disorder, that's obviously going to damage metabolism, and we've talked about that already. But I want to point out that anorexia, even though that's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, that eating so little is really doing damage to metabolism as well, and that the weight is low, not because metabolism is high, but because what they're taking in is very, very low. Genetics, of course, can also play a role in these pieces as well, in that genes can determine weight and metabolism in a variety of ways. And we talked about those earlier in going over obesity. And weight can kind of set the stage for the eating disorders, in that being at a higher weight at a younger age can set a person up for binge eating disorder, or going through menarche or menstruation at a younger age can set a girl up for bulimia. So there are a ton of different ways in which the biological kind of markers of weight and puberty can set people up for eating disorders as well. But beyond that, binge eating disorder also seems to be associated with the same genes as many of the addictive disorders. Psychologically, personality affects an individual's tendencies towards these disorders as well. So that doesn't mean that just because you are perfectionistic that you're going to get anorexia, but that more people with anorexia tend to be perfectionistic, neurotic, controlling, obsessive, versus people with bulimia tend to be more impulsive, and people with binge eating disorders tend to be more addictive in nature. And so it's interesting that the type of person can kind of drive you, towards one of these diagnoses versus another. It's more likely that someone with anorexia is going to have an anxiety disorder first, whether that's like a social anxiety or like an obsessive compulsive disorder. That's something that we see pretty commonly. Another psychological factor is unhealthy thoughts or emotions that may be linked to the internalization of the thin ideal, which I'll show you guys on the next slide. And then socially, Western cultures kind of set the stage for a lot of the psychological stuff that I just discussed. Beyond that, social isolation can be a risk factor for specifically anorexia, and your mom being dissatisfied with her body can be a general risk factor for all three of these. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about today is the sociocultural theory, which is basically a way of explaining how this thin ideal, this idea that the thin body type is the body type to pursue, how that kind of becomes internalized and begins to affect behaviors. So what happens is that people are exposed to thin ideals. This exposure begins early, Barbie being the classic example for little girls, but also if you look at more kind of masculine types of characters, there's typically very unrealistic musculature there as well. So this exposure happens early, kind of across the board, I would say, regardless of sex or gender of the child. So initially, this is just exposure to an ideal. So this is simply playing with a toy or watching a show and just kind of seeing characters who have these ideal bodies. But eventually, this ideal becomes becomes internalized, meaning that it shifts from being this outward thing that you're just kind of experiencing to now you are wanting to look like those characters. You are wanting to pursue that ideal as well. So it's now becoming personally important to you versus just something kind of external that you were exposed to. At this point, the person observes a discrepancy between their actual and their ideal body, and that dissatisfaction leads to altered eating. Typically, restriction, which in some cases remains restriction, like with anorexia. In other cases, that restriction is too great and it ends up being paired with binges. And then in some cases, a person just outwardly binges as a way to cope with negative emotion, and there's no compensation associated at all. So again, this is something that happens very early. It's something that's pervasive, that continues as we get older, a la, Photoshop and social media. And this is really a key psychological piece that sets up all three of the eating disorders, in addition to some of the more specific pieces that I discussed on the previous slide. As far as treatment goes, I don't really want to get too into it in this particular lecture because I just think that's a little bit beyond the scope of the class. But in a nutshell, because the eating disorders are psychological and biological in nature, treatment should entail a mental health professional and a physical health professional. So there should be a doctor monitoring electrolyte levels, weight, blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that. There should be a mental health professional who's in charge of more of the therapeutic pieces. Ideally, there should be some kind of dietitian or nutritionist who's kind of monitoring food. So it should be a very multidisciplinary type of approach. And typically speaking, we're aiming at restoring weight first, particularly in situations where weight is dangerously high or dangerously low. So typically we want to prioritize those appointments, and then we kind of want to start layering in more of the mental health types of approaches later on. All right, so this is all that I have for you guys. Make sure to read those kind of side readings and keep track of any questions that you have, and we will talk about this more later on. All right, thanks for joining me.